Hello everyone! Today I'm trying a recipe I found on Reddit. It is from the stingyvegan.com and it's cherry oatmeal bars, and I wanted to make this because I realized recently when I bought a bag of frozen cherries mixed with other fruit that I haven't actually eaten cherries in a really long time aside from those. And I was like, oh, I gotta make some cherry desserts. So I wanted to make a sugar-free dessert, and this recipe is not sugar-free originally. So yeah, the top popped off. I needed to use a trusty can opener for this can. So when I was searching for ingredients for the recipe, the recipe says a jar of sour cherries in light syrup, 24 ounces. Those aren't available sugar-free. So I said, "Ooh, look, here's a pie filling. Let me just do that. It's the same thing." But I didn't actually need to do this step that you're seeing now. The recipe says if you get a jar of cherries that you will drain the syrup, take a cup of the drained syrup and reserve it aside. Take from there 3 tablespoons of syrup and mix that with 2 tablespoons of cornstarch. And then you're going to pour those ingredients plus I want to say it's 3/4 cup of sugar, brown sugar, I believe. Yes, into a saucepan and cook it and like let it solidify, let the sauce or the cherry juice coagulate like you see. So my husband eventually came over and was like, because I was like, oh my God, this stuff won't strain. What am I doing? Let me just see if I can like get a cup of it out of the jar and reserve it in this bowl and measure out a cup. And he walks over and he's like, that's his hand. He's tasting it too. He's like, this is the final ingredient. You can start on step 4. And he said, there's sugar in it already. It's fake sugar. It's sucralose. So I was like, all right, great. I'm stopping. That was weird. So if you want it sugar-free, I do recommend starting with the sugar-free pie filling. And then you're going to be adding 1.5 cups of oatmeal and then 1.5 cups of flour into a large bowl or your stand mixer, which is where we are right now in the video. I will admit that the recipe says to use instant oatmeal, which I don't have and I'm not about to buy just for one recipe. So I said, whatever, I'll use my rolled oats. It'll be fine. So there's a potential slight change. I actually haven't had real oatmeal in a really long time, so I don't know how different it would be. Then you'll add a teaspoon of baking soda and a 1/2 teaspoon of salt and mix all those dry ingredients together. So this is what it looks like. It's all well incorporated. That's a word I should be using more often in these videos instead of saying everything's mixed well. So that was 1/2 a stick of butter. You're going to take 3/4 cup of butter, or in this case, vegan butter, so margarine, whatever your favorite butter substitute is. That's 1.5 sticks for those of you using sticks, and I just threw in 1/2 a stick to start to see what it was like, and it's still rather dry, surprisingly. So the recipe also says to sort of like cut it up into pats, so I'll be doing that to see if that helps, although I don't know why it would. It's not melted. Maybe it needs to be melted to really sort of absorb the oats, or maybe I have the wrong kind of oatmeal because we did say we started out with a substitute already there. The original recipe does say to just pour this into a large bowl and use a fork to smash the butter. But when I do that, my body tends to block the camera, so I prefer to use the stand mixer. So it's still pretty crumbly, and that was like 2/3 of the butter I'm supposed to use. So, oh no, not quite 2/3. We'll just keep adding butter and hope that we get the consistency we want. Normally, when I say a recipe I'm making is vegan, I do follow the vegan rules. And when I advertise it as vegan in the title, it's got margarine rather than butter in it, or some other substitute. So I do admit this one I used half a stick of vegan margarine and then a whole stick of cow butter, just because it was available in the fridge and I'm not vegan. And I needed to use it up because it was going to go bad. My husband sees the butter and he's like, "Oh my God, you're the baker. Use this up." And I just buy margarine at this point. But we sometimes have had butter um, just because it's been around. So it's like we'll just use whatever's there. So still pretty crumbly. Gonna throw some more butter. And the reason I used butter instead of just going for the fresher margarine was because I find that it's pretty much identical in these recipes. I don't notice any difference when I'm using butter versus margarine. So I figured it would taste the same. And those of you who are vegan and want to make sure you're using vegan margarine will understand that the taste I got was the same taste you got, but you can follow the recipe the same exact way, only using your preferred ingredients, and it will come out the same way. Here is the finished oat crust. I'm squeezing it here to show how um, the butter has incorporated into the dough. I guess I'm going to call this the crust. So it's not super like solid when you squeeze it, but it definitely still holds its shape. Because I used rolled oats instead of instant, I'm going to let the oats absorb the butter for 30 minutes before I continue. Now I'm going to spray an 8x8 baking pan with canola oil, whatever nonstick spray you have. The recipe says to use parchment paper, but this does not stick to the pan at all, so you're safe just spraying. Now we're going to take the crust oat stuff and take 3/4 of it to use as the base and save 1/4 of what you've made to use for the top. If you're liking this recipe so far, please like, share, and subscribe so that you never miss one of our amazing recipes. Once you've poured the crust, pat it down with your hand, make sure it's nice and firm, and then pour on the cherries. You want all of the sauce, and if you cooked your cherries the way the original recipe says, then you will probably need to stick it in the refrigerator so that it coagulates properly and quicker. Otherwise, you might be waiting a while for it to be ready to pop onto the crust. Spread it out so that it touches, all the sides. And then you'll add the remaining oat crust to the top and gently pat that down. It still looks very dry here. Like I wasn't expecting it to pour out like it was, just regular, unaltered oatmeal. So this recipe is scaring me at the moment. Pat everything down. Don't go too hard, otherwise you'll get like cherry juice through your fingers. Then you're going to bake it for 350 degrees. The recipe says to bake it for 350 degrees for 30 to 35 minutes, and I did 34 just because I kept pressing the button. I wanted to hit 33, which is right in the middle, and it did not. So, whatever. The recipe says the top should be golden brown, and it is not golden brown. It doesn't look like it's been touched at all, so I'm going to add 3 more minutes to the cooking time, and it still doesn't look like it's been touched. So we're going to add 5 more minutes to the cooking time. And after that made no improvement, my husband said, it'll never cook at 350. Put it at 450 for 10 minutes, and that is the result. So I would recommend doing that. I mean, everything is for the most part cooked, so you really are only trying to brown the top. And then it does say to let it cool completely, so I put the timer on for 30 minutes, but we were in the middle of a Disney cartoon, so I actually let it cool till the movie was over. So that was probably more like an hour, and then I cut it. So my recommendation is to bake it at 450 for 10 minutes, or 350 for an hour if that's preferable. Anyway, just keep an eye on it. Make sure it gets brown and doesn't like burn. And as you can see, the thing kind of fell apart when I cut a little square. It's not something I expected to need to eat with a fork. So I was a little surprised at that, and this is honestly just because there's not enough butter in the crust. And that could be because I'm using rolled oats instead of instant oatmeal. My fault. I guess I'll just have to guess on how much butter you should be adding. A full like cup and a half. I don't know. Maybe use less crust because it didn't really add that much. It was still pretty good. My husband tasted it and he's like, oh, the crust needs sugar too. So I think maybe you should also add like half a cup of sugar or sucralose to the crust and more butter if you're using the kind of oatmeal I am. And it should be fine. I hope you enjoyed this recipe. Happy eating!